I never thought my own parents would try to destroy me, but when I discovered what they did while I was locked in that basement for 3 days, everything changed. My mother told the police I was out with friends, while my father kept me trapped in darkness, saying 3 days would fix my attitude. They thought they had the perfect plan to break me down and control my life forever, but they never counted on the security camera my neighbor installed or what that footage would reveal about their twisted scheme. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs months earlier. My name is Audrey, and at 26 years old, I thought I was just going through a rough patch after losing my graphic design job at a marketing firm in Denver. What I didn't realize was that my parents, Robert and Linda, had been systematically destroying my chances of independence for longer than I could have imagined. Our house on Maple Street looked like something from a suburban dream. Linda had cultivated the perfect image as a successful real estate agent, always dressed immaculately in her tailored blazers and pearl earrings. She volunteered at the local animal shelter every Saturday morning and brought homemade cookies to neighborhood gatherings. Robert worked as an insurance claims manager downtown, the kind of man who mowed his lawn in perfect diagonal lines and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. But behind our white picket fence, something far more sinister was unfolding. I had moved back home temporarily after my layoffs, expecting it to be a brief arrangement while I found new employment. What started as a few weeks stretched into months, and every job interview I scheduled seemed to fall through at the last minute. Companies would call to reschedule, then cancel entirely. Freelance clients who had been eager to work with me would suddenly become unreachable. My friends started distancing themselves too. Sarah, who had been my college roommate and closest confidant, stopped returning my calls. When I bumped into her at the grocery store, she seemed uncomfortable and claimed she'd been too busy with work to maintain our friendship. Emma, my workout partner from the gym, canceled our regular sessions and eventually stopped responding to my messages entirely. The financial pressure mounted as my savings dwindled. Every application for unemployment benefits seemed to get lost in bureaucratic delays. My bank account showed mysterious fees that I couldn't explain, small amounts that added up over time. When I questioned the charges, customer service representatives claimed they had no record of them being disputed. Robert would sit across from me at dinner, cutting his pot roast with mechanical precision while discussing my job search. His suggestions always sounded helpful on the surface, but something felt wrong about the way he steered me away from certain opportunities. When I mentioned applying to companies outside Denver, he would launch into detailed explanations about why those positions weren't suitable for someone with my limited experience. Linda played the supportive mother, perfectly bringing me tea while I worked on my portfolio and offering to help with my resume. She would review my application materials and suggest changes that seemed minor, but somehow made my qualifications sound less impressive. When potential employers called the house phone, she would take messages that never seemed to reach me in time to return the calls. The isolation crept up gradually. Without work colleagues to interact with daily and friends who had mysteriously become unavailable, my world had shrunk to the confines of our suburban home. I spent hours in my childhood bedroom, staring at job posting websites and wondering why every opportunity seemed to slip through my fingers. My younger brother Tyler had moved to Portland for college and rarely came home, leaving me alone with Robert and Linda's increasingly attentive concern for my well-being. They suggested I might be suffering from depression and recommended seeing a therapist they had researched. When I expressed interest, Linda scheduled appointments that somehow never materialized due to insurance complications or scheduling conflicts. Then came the day I accidentally discovered the truth behind months of failure and frustration. I was using Robert's laptop to print out application materials when his email program automatically opened. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were dozens of emails between my father and various employers, politely explaining that his daughter was experiencing mental health difficulties and might not be a reliable employee. He had contacted my references and suggested they might want to reconsider their recommendations. The messages revealed a calculated campaign of sabotage that explained every missed opportunity, every canceled interview, every friendship that had mysteriously ended. Robert had been posing as a concerned parent, reaching out to protect potential employers from hiring someone he described as emotionally unstable and prone to dramatic episodes. But the emails were just the beginning. Hidden in a folder labeled insurance documents were screenshots of my text messages, copies of my social media posts, and detailed logs of my daily activities. They had been monitoring every aspect of my digital life, tracking my location through my phone, and building what looked like evidence for some kind of legal proceeding. The most chilling discovery was a consultation summary from a lawyer specializing in adult guardianship cases. The document outlined the process for having an adult child declared mentally incompetent, including the types of evidence needed and the timeline for court proceedings. In the margins, Linda had written notes about my behavior describing normal reactions to unemployment and isolation as signs of psychological instability. I realized with growing horror that my parents weren't trying to help me get back on my feet. They were systematically destroying my ability to function independently, creating a paper trail to support a claim that I was incapable of managing my own life. Every kind gesture, every offer of assistance, every expression of concern had been part of a deliberate plan to trap me in a state of complete dependence. The perfect suburban family was nothing but a carefully constructed facade, hiding something much darker underneath. I printed out the most damaging emails and confronted my parents that evening during dinner. The transformation in their demeanor was immediate and terrifying. Robert set down his fork with deliberate calm, his eyes never leaving my face as I spread the evidence across our dining room table. The man who had spent months expressing gentle concern for my well-being suddenly looked at me with the cold calculation of a predator whose prey had become unexpectedly troublesome. "You went through my private emails," he said, his voice carrying a tone I had never heard before. "That shows exactly the kind of poor judgment and boundary violations we've been worried about." Linda continued eating her salad as if nothing unusual was happening. "Sweetheart, you're getting yourself all worked up over some professional correspondence. Your father was simply looking out for your best interests." I held up the guardianship consultation papers. "Looking out for my interests, you've been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. You sabotaged my job interviews and turned my friends against me. We've been documenting concerning behaviors," Robert replied, leaning back in his chair with unsettling composure. "The paranoia you're displaying right now is exactly what we've been tracking. No reasonable person would interpret professional networking as sabotage." The gaslighting was so smooth and practiced that for a moment I questioned my own perception of what I had read. But the evidence was right there in black and white, impossible to misinterpret or explain away. Linda reached across the table and patted my hand with mock sympathy. "Honey, we've been consulting with professionals because we love you. You've been struggling for months, unable to maintain employment or relationships. We want to make sure you get the help you need." "Help." I yanked my hand away from her touch. "You've been systematically destroying my life and building a legal case to control me permanently." Robert's mask slipped further as his voice hardened. "You're 26 years old and living in your childhood bedroom, completely dependent on us for food and shelter. You haven't been able to hold a job or maintain a friendship. Any objective observer would have concerns about your ability to function independently, because you made it impossible." I stood up so quickly my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "You contacted my employers and my friends. You intercepted my calls and sabotaged my applications. You created this situation deliberately. We documented your decline." Linda corrected her real estate agent's smile, never wavering. "There's a difference between causing problems and recognizing when they already exist." I realized they had been preparing for this confrontation, rehearsing their responses, and building their narrative for months. Every conversation, every interaction had been calculated to support their version of events. They weren't just planning to control my future. They had been rewriting my past to justify it. "I'm leaving," I announced, gathering up the printed emails. "I'm going to the police and showing them what you've been doing." Robert's laugh was genuinely amused. "And tell them what exactly that your loving parents have been concerned about your mental health, that we've been in contact with potential employers to provide references, that we've consulted with legal professionals about our options for getting you help." The confidence in his voice made my stomach drop. They had thought this through, completely anticipating every possible response and preparing counter-arguments that would make me look exactly as unstable as they claimed. Linda stood and began clearing the dinner plates as if we'd been discussing weekend plans instead of my fundamental freedom. "Audrey, if you try to involve outside authorities in our family matters, it will only provide more evidence that you're not thinking clearly. Any police officer or social worker will see a young woman making wild accusations against parents who are obviously trying to help. Besides," Robert added, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his phone, "we've been recording these conversations for weeks. Would you like to hear how you sound when you're having one of your episodes?" I felt the walls closing in around me as I realized the scope of their preparation. They hadn't just been monitoring my digital communications, they had been recording our private conversations and building an audio library of my responses to their psychological manipulation. "You can't do this," I said, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice and hating how it proved their point about my emotional instability. "Actually, we can..." Robert replied, his insurance adjuster training evident in his methodical approach to crushing my resistance. "We've consulted with medical professionals, legal experts, and law enforcement contacts. Everyone agrees that intervention is necessary when an adult child shows signs of deteriorating mental health." He pulled up his phone and showed me a contact list that included therapists, lawyers, and what appeared to be social workers. "We have a comprehensive support network ready to help you transition into appropriate care. The question is whether you're going to cooperate voluntarily or whether we need to pursue involuntary commitment procedures." The threat was delivered with the same calm professionalism he used to deny insurance claims. I understood that my parents had spent months building an unassailable case for taking complete control of my life, and they were prepared to use the legal system to enforce their will. Linda finished loading the dishwasher and turned back to face me with that same artificial warmth. "We're not the enemy here, sweetheart. We're the people who love you enough to make difficult decisions for your own good. Once you accept that this will all be much easier for everyone involved." I backed toward the kitchen door, clutching the printed emails against my chest, like a shield that I now realized was completely inadequate protection against what they had planned. "If you try to leave this house tonight," Robert said quietly, "I'll call for a welfare check and tell them you're having a psychotic episode. The responding officers will see an agitated young woman making incoherent accusations against concerned parents. How do you think that encounter will end?" The trap was perfect and complete. They had eliminated my support network, destroyed my financial independence, documented my emotional responses to their psychological torture, and positioned themselves as loving parents dealing with a troubled adult child. Any attempt to escape or seek help would only provide more evidence for their narrative. I was completely alone, facing opponents who had been planning this victory for longer than I could have imagined. The next evening, Linda prepared my favorite meal with unusual attention to detail. She made herb-crusted salmon with roasted vegetables and garlic mashed potatoes, the same dinner she used to cook for my birthday celebrations when I was younger. The familiar aromas filled the kitchen with memories of happier times, creating a jarring contrast with the tension that had dominated our house since my confrontation with Robert. "I thought we could have a fresh start," Linda said, setting the beautifully plated meal in front of me. "Yesterday was emotional for everyone, but we're family. We should be able to work through our differences." Robert nodded from across the table, cutting his salmon into precise portions. "Your mother and I discussed your concerns about our approach. We realize we may have seemed heavy-handed, but our intentions have always been to support you. The shift in their demeanor was so dramatic that I wondered if I had misunderstood the severity of their plans. Maybe the legal consultation had been a precaution rather than an active threat. Maybe I had overreacted to what amounted to parental concern expressed in misguided ways. "I know you both love me," I said, carefully testing the waters. "I just need some space to figure things out on my own terms." Linda smiled warmly and poured sparkling cider into my wine glass. "Of course, honey. Independence is important at your age. We just want to make sure you have a solid foundation before you take that step." The meal was delicious, and despite my lingering suspicions, I found myself relaxing as we discussed neutral topics, like Linda's latest real estate sales and Robert's plans for updating the backyard landscaping. The conversation felt almost normal, reminiscent of family dinners from my teenage years, when my biggest concerns were homework assignments and weekend plans with friends. About halfway through dinner, I started feeling unusually drowsy. The sensation crept up gradually, like the heaviness that comes after a large holiday meal, but more intense, and accompanied by a strange lightheadedness that made it difficult to focus on the conversation. "Are you feeling all right, sweetheart?" Linda asked with apparent concern. "You look a little pale." I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the growing fog in my head. "I think I might be getting sick. I feel really tired all of a sudden." Robert suggested I might be having a delayed stress reaction to our previous day's discussion. Emotional confrontations can be physically exhausting. Maybe you should get some rest after dinner. The drowsiness intensified rapidly, and I struggled to keep my eyes open as Linda cleared away my half-finished plate. My limbs felt heavy and uncooperative, as if I was sinking into quicksand. The last thing I remembered clearly was Robert helping me stand up from the dining room chair, his arms supporting my weight as my legs gave out beneath me. When consciousness returned, everything was wrong. I was lying on a cold concrete floor in complete darkness, and my wrists were secured behind my back with what felt like zip ties. The air smelled of dampness and mold, and I could hear the distant hum of a furnace running somewhere nearby. As my eyes adjusted to the blackness, I realized I was in our basement, but not the finished recreation area where we used to watch movies during my childhood. This was the storage section behind the furnace, a cramped space filled with old furniture and holiday decorations that we rarely accessed. The concrete walls were rough and unfinished, and the single small window near the ceiling was covered with what looked like black plastic sheeting. My ankles were also restrained, connected to a heavy chain that was bolted to one of the support beams. The setup was clearly not improvised. Someone had spent time and effort creating a secure holding area designed to keep a person completely immobilized. I tried to call out, but my voice came out as a hoarse croak. The drugs were still affecting my system, leaving me disoriented and weak. As I struggled to sit up against the concrete wall, footsteps creaked across the ceiling above me, confirming that Robert and Linda were in the house, probably finishing their dinner and cleaning up the kitchen as if nothing unusual had happened. The basement door opened, and light from the stairwell created a rectangular outline against the darkness. Robert's silhouette appeared at the top of the steps, and he descended slowly, carrying what looked like a camping chair and a small electronic device. "Good you're awake," he said, with the same matter-of-fact tone he used to discuss insurance claims at work. I was beginning to worry about the dosage. He set up the chair about 6 feet away from where I was chained and positioned the electronic device on a cardboard box. As my vision cleared, I realized it was a video camera pointed directly at me. "What are you doing?" I managed to whisper. "Documenting your treatment," Robert replied, adjusting the camera angle. "This is your attitude adjustment period. 3 days of isolation will give you time to reflect on your behavior and appreciate the support system you've been taking for granted." The casual way he discussed my imprisonment made it clear this wasn't an impulsive decision made in anger. This was a premeditated plan, carefully thought out and methodically executed. "You can't keep me down here," I said, my voice growing stronger as the drugs continued to wear off. "People will notice I'm missing." Robert laughed softly. Your mother has already handled that concern. As far as anyone knows, you're on a spontaneous camping trip with friends from college. It's exactly the kind of impulsive decision that demonstrates your need for better supervision. He reached over and pressed a button on the camera. A small red light indicated it was now recording. "This is session number 4, he said, speaking directly to the camera. The subject has been escalating her defiant behavior and making threats against her family. Previous interventions have been ineffective, necessitating a more intensive approach." My blood turned to ice as I processed what he had said. Session number 4 meant this wasn't the first time they had done this to me. There had been 3 previous occasions when I had been drugged and chained in this basement, and I had no memory of any of them. "You've drugged me before," I said, the horrible realization washing over me. Robert nodded matter-of-factly. "Whenever your behavior required correction, the memory gaps you've been experiencing weren't from stress or depression. They were scheduled interventions designed to modify your attitude and reinforce appropriate boundaries." I remembered now the strange periods over the past year when I would lose chunks of time waking up feeling sick and disoriented, with no clear recollection of the previous day or two. I had attributed the episodes to mental health struggles related to my unemployment and isolation, never suspecting they were actually the result of systematic abuse. "Linda told everyone you had stomach flu." Robert continued reviewing footage on the camera's small screen. "Amazing how convincing she can be when she puts her mind to it. No one ever questioned why you seemed so tired and confused afterward." The scope of their operation was far more extensive than I had initially realized. They hadn't just been monitoring my communications and sabotaging my job prospects. They had been physically controlling and psychologically conditioning me for months, erasing my memories of their abuse and leaving me to wonder why I felt so unstable and confused. Robert stood up and moved toward the stairs. 3 days should be sufficient this time, assuming you demonstrate appropriate remorse and gratitude when it's over. If not, we'll extend the session until your attitude improves." He paused at the bottom of the steps and looked back at me with genuine curiosity. "It really is fascinating how much more compliant you become after these sessions. The human mind is remarkably adaptable when properly motivated." The basement plunged back into darkness as he turned off the lights and closed the door behind him, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge that my parents had been torturing me for months, while I blamed myself for symptoms I couldn't understand or explain. The first day stretched endlessly in the suffocating darkness. Without any reference point for time, I couldn't tell if hours or minutes had passed since Robert left me chained in the basement. The concrete floor leached warmth from my body, and the zip ties cut into my wrists whenever I tried to adjust my position. My mouth felt like sandpaper from whatever drug they had given me, and the growing hunger pangs reminded me that dinner had been my last meal. Robert's promise of 3 days without food took on a more ominous meaning as I calculated how long I could survive under these conditions. I tested the strength of my restraints, methodically searching for any weakness in the chain or the bolt securing me to the support beam. Everything was professionally installed and designed to hold much more weight than I could generate. The zip ties were the heavy-duty industrial kind used by police departments, impossible to break without tools. The psychological impact was worse than the physical discomfort. Being trapped in complete darkness triggered a primal terror that rational thought couldn't overcome. Every sound from the house above became magnified in my imagination. Footsteps across the kitchen floor meant Robert and Linda were going about their normal routines while I suffered in their basement prison. I tried calling for help, but our house was well insulated and set back from the street on a large lot. Our nearest neighbors were too far away to hear anything short of screaming, and I wasn't sure I had the energy to sustain that level of noise for long enough to attract attention. The worst part was understanding how carefully they had planned this imprisonment. The basement location was perfect for their purposes. No one would think to look for me there, and the concrete walls would muffle any sounds I made. The psychological impact of being held captive in my own family home added an extra layer of violation that made the experience even more traumatic. Sometime during what I estimated was the middle of the first night, I heard the basement door open again. Light spilled down the stairwell and Linda's silhouette appeared, carrying a small bottle of water and what looked like a washcloth. "Oh, sweetheart," she said in the same sympathetic tone she used when I was sick as a child. "You look so uncomfortable down here." She descended the stairs, carefully holding the water like a precious gift. Her makeup was perfect despite the late hour, and she was wearing her silk pajama set, the one she saved for special occasions. "I brought you some water," she said, kneeling beside me and holding the bottle to my lips. "You must be so thirsty." The cool water was exactly what my body craved, and I drank gratefully despite knowing she was responsible for my imprisonment. The motherly care she was showing felt genuine, creating a confusing mix of gratitude and anger that made it hard to think clearly. "I know this seems harsh." Linda continued using the washcloth to wipe my face with gentle strokes. "But sometimes we have to do difficult things for the people we love. Your father and I have been so worried about your attitude lately." Her touch was so tender and familiar that part of me wanted to believe this was all a misunderstanding that could be resolved if I just apologized and promised to do better. "Mom, please," I whispered. "This is wrong. You can't keep me chained up like an animal." Linda's expression shifted to one of patient concern, as if I was a confused child who needed gentle correction. "Honey, you've been so angry and defiant lately. The way you spoke to your father yesterday was completely unacceptable. We needed to give you some time to think about how your behavior affects the whole family." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone, setting it on the floor beside her. "I want you to tell me how you're feeling right now. It's important for us to understand your emotional state during this process." Something about the way she positioned the phone and her emphasis on my emotional state triggered a warning in my mind. I looked more carefully at the device and noticed it was recording our conversation. "Are you recording me?" I asked. Linda smiled warmly. "Just for therapeutic purposes, sweetheart. We want to make sure we're providing the best possible care during your recovery period." The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a mercy visit from a concerned mother. It was another layer of their psychological manipulation. They were recording my responses to imprisonment and torture, probably planning to use my desperation and confusion as evidence of mental instability. "Tell me about your fears," Linda prompted gently. "What thoughts are going through your mind right now?" I understood then that anything I said would be twisted to support their narrative. If I expressed anger, they would claim I was violent and unstable. If I begged for release, they would say I was unable to accept responsibility for my actions. If I remained silent, they would characterize me as sullen and uncooperative. "I know what you're doing," I said, keeping my voice as steady as possible despite my terror. "This recording isn't for therapy. You're trying to collect evidence to use against me." Linda's mask of maternal concern flickered for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Sweetheart, you're being paranoid. We're documenting your progress so we can provide the best possible care." She reached out to touch my forehead as if checking for fever, but I pulled away from her hand. The movement was awkward because of my restraints, and I probably looked exactly as unstable as she wanted me to appear on camera. "You've been isolating yourself from friends and family for months." Linda continued, speaking more to the phone than to me. "Your emotional responses have become increasingly inappropriate. Yesterday, you made accusations against your father and me that were completely unfounded." Her voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to presenting convincing arguments to skeptical clients. She was building a case against me in real time, using my imprisonment as an opportunity to generate evidence for whatever legal proceedings they had planned. "Can you explain why you went through your father's private emails without permission?" she asked. "That kind of boundary violation is very concerning." I remained silent, refusing to give them any more ammunition to use against me. Linda waited patiently for several minutes, then picked up her phone and stopped the recording. "Your lack of cooperation is noted," she said in a much cooler tone. "We had hoped this intervention would help you develop some insight into your behavior, but resistance is unfortunately common in cases like yours." She stood up and gathered the water bottle, which I noticed she hadn't allowed me to finish. We'll try again tomorrow. Hopefully some additional time for reflection will help you approach this process more constructively. As she climbed the stairs and the basement returned to darkness, I realized that Linda was actually enjoying this experience. The caring mother routine was just another performance in a long series of manipulative presentations. She was genuinely excited about having me completely at their mercy, unable to resist their control or escape their surveillance. The psychological warfare was just beginning, and they had been planning this campaign much longer than I had initially understood. The second day brought a new level of physical misery that made coherent thought increasingly difficult. The hunger had evolved from uncomfortable pangs to a constant gnawing ache that seemed to consume energy from every part of my body. My lips were cracked from dehydration, and the small amount of water Linda had given me felt like a cruel tease that had only intensified my thirst. The concrete floor had become my entire world, cold and unforgiving against my increasingly sore body. I had tried every possible position to find some comfort, but the restraints made it impossible to lie down properly or sit up without putting painful pressure on my wrists and ankles. The darkness was so complete that I began to lose track of whether my eyes were open or closed. Above me, the house continued its normal rhythms. I could hear the coffee maker gurgling in the early morning, the shower running as my parents prepared for their day, and the garage door opening as they left for work. The ordinariness of these sounds created a surreal contrast with my desperate situation. They were maintaining their regular schedules while keeping me imprisoned in their basement. What I didn't know was that my absence had already been noticed by the one person who understood me well enough to recognize when something was fundamentally wrong. Jessica Martinez had been my closest friend since our sophomore year of college, when we were paired as lab partners in our graphic design fundamentals course. Unlike the other relationships my parents had systematically destroyed, my friendship with Jessica had deeper roots that were harder to sever. She knew details about my personality and fears that Robert and Linda couldn't have anticipated when they crafted their cover story. Jessica had tried calling me repeatedly over the past 2 days, growing more concerned when her calls went straight to voicemail. My phone was upstairs in my bedroom, deliberately placed there by my parents to maintain the illusion that I had left voluntarily. But Jessica knew my communication habits well enough to recognize that prolonged silence was completely out of character. On the second morning of my imprisonment, she decided to drive to our house and check on me directly. She arrived around 10:30, parking her blue Honda Civic in our driveway and walking up to the front door with the casual confidence of someone who had been visiting our home for years. Linda answered the door wearing her real estate blazer and her most professional smile. "Jessica, what a lovely surprise. I'm afraid Audrey isn't here right now." "Oh, that's weird," Jessica replied, glancing toward my car, which was parked in its usual spot beside the garage. "Her car is here, and she hasn't been answering her phone for 2 days. I was getting worried." Linda's expression shifted to one of maternal amusement. "You know how spontaneous she can be. She decided to go on a camping trip with some college friends. They picked her up yesterday morning." Jessica's internal alarm bells began ringing immediately. She knew about my lifelong phobia of outdoor camping, which stemmed from a traumatic experience during a Girl Scout trip when I was 8 years old. I'd gotten lost in the woods for several hours and had developed an intense fear of sleeping outside that persisted into adulthood. The idea that I would voluntarily go camping, especially without telling Jessica, was completely implausible. "Camping?" Jessica asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite her growing suspicions. "That doesn't sound like Audrey at all. She's terrified of sleeping outdoors." Linda waved dismissively. "Oh, that old fear she's been working on getting over it. I think this trip is exactly what she needs to build some confidence and independence." The explanation felt rehearsed and artificial, lacking the natural flow of genuine surprise at an unexpected visitor. Jessica noticed that Linda was blocking the doorway rather than inviting her inside, which was unusual given their previous friendly interactions. "When did she leave exactly?" Jessica pressed. "I talked to her 2 days ago and she didn't mention any plans." It was very last minute, Linda replied smoothly. You know how young people can be with their spontaneous adventures. She'll probably be back in a week or so with all sorts of stories to tell. Jessica nodded and smiled, pretending to accept the explanation, while her mind raced through the inconsistencies. Audrey never made spontaneous plans, especially not major trips that would require time away from her job search. She was methodical and careful about her commitments, always keeping Jessica informed about her schedule and activities. Could I leave her a note in her room? Jessica asked. I wanted to tell her about a freelance opportunity that might be perfect for her. I don't think that's necessary. Linda said, her real estate training evident in how smoothly she deflected the request. I'll make sure to pass along any messages when she calls to check in. As Jessica turned to leave, she made a mental note of several disturbing details. Linda's explanation had been too polished, as if she had been preparing for exactly this conversation. The timing was suspicious, given that Audrey had seemed completely normal during their last phone call. Most importantly, Linda had shown no concern about her daughter's unusual communication silence, which was completely out of character for someone as protective as she usually appeared to be. Jessica drove slowly through the neighborhood, parking 2 blocks away where she could think without being observed. She pulled out her phone and called Audrey's workplace contact for her most recent freelance project, a small marketing firm that had hired her for a website redesign. Oh, we were wondering what happened, the project manager told Jessica. Her mother called yesterday and said Audrey had to quit the project due to a family emergency. It was very unprofessional, especially since we were close to our deadline. The pieces were beginning to form a disturbing pattern. Linda had proactively contacted Audrey's employer to explain her absence, suggesting advanced planning rather than a spontaneous trip. The family emergency story contradicted the camping trip explanation, indicating that different lies were being told to different people. Jessica spent the next several hours calling other mutual friends and acquaintances, carefully probing for any information about Audrey's recent activities or planned travels. No one had heard anything about a camping trip. Several people mentioned that they hadn't been able to reach Audrey recently, but they had attributed her silence to the stress of unemployment and family pressure. As the afternoon wore on, Jessica's concern deepened into genuine alarm. Every detail of Linda's story felt wrong, and the contradictory explanations to different people suggested a deliberate campaign of deception. She knew Audrey well enough to recognize that something serious had happened, something that required the kind of careful cover-up that Linda was providing. By evening, Jessica had made a decision that would change everything. She drove back to our neighborhood and parked across the street from our house, settling in for a surveillance session that would either confirm her suspicions or put her mind at ease. What she observed over the next several hours convinced her that her worst fears were justified. Robert and Linda maintained their normal evening routine, but there was no sign of activity in my bedroom window, no indication that anyone was home, except the two of them. More troubling was what she heard when she rolled down her car windows and listened carefully to the ambient sounds from our property. Around midnight, she detected what sounded like muffled tapping or banging coming from the direction of our basement. The sounds were rhythmic and persistent, lasting for several minutes before stopping abruptly. They resumed again about an hour later, following the same pattern of desperate repetition, followed by sudden silence. Jessica had found her proof that something terrible was happening inside our perfect suburban home. Down in the basement, my desperate attempts to signal for help had become increasingly frantic as my physical condition deteriorated. The rhythmic tapping Jessica had heard was my attempt to communicate through the water pipes that ran along the basement ceiling, the only solid surface I could reach with my limited mobility. I had discovered that if I positioned myself carefully against the support beam, I could use my foot to kick against the main water line in a steady pattern. 3 short kicks followed by 3 longer ones, then 3 short kicks again. It was Morse code for SOS, a skill I had learned during a brief stint in Girl Scouts before my camping phobia ended my outdoor adventures. The effort was exhausting in my weakened state, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Every few hours I would summon the energy to deliver my metallic plea for help, hoping against hope that someone might recognize the pattern and investigate its source. My lips were now split and bleeding from dehydration, and the hunger had evolved into something that felt like my stomach was consuming itself from the inside. I was beginning to experience brief moments of disorientation, where the darkness seemed to shift and move around me, creating phantom shapes that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. The psychological torture was becoming harder to resist as my physical defenses crumbled. I found myself thinking about Linda's offer of water and wondering if cooperation might earn me some relief from this suffering. The part of my mind that understood their manipulation was losing ground to more primitive survival instincts. Meanwhile, Jessica had spent a sleepless night in her car documenting everything she observed and developing a plan of action. She understood that approaching the police with nothing but suspicions and inconsistent stories would likely be dismissed, especially given Linda's reputation as a respected member of the community. She needed concrete evidence or a witness who could corroborate her concerns. As dawn broke over our suburban street, Jessica remembered a conversation from several months earlier when our elderly neighbor, Harold, had mentioned installing a new security system after a series of break-ins in the area. Harold lived in the house directly behind ours with a backyard that shared a fence line with our property. If his cameras were positioned to monitor his own backyard, they might also capture activity around our basement area. Harold Zimmerman was a 72-year-old retired electrician who had lived on Maple Street for over 30 years. He was the kind of neighbor who kept careful watch over the community, always ready with a wave from his front porch or a helping hand for anyone who needed assistance with home repairs. His wife Margaret had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving him alone in their modest ranch house, with too much time to observe the activities of his neighbors. Jessica approached his front door around 8 o'clock in the morning, when she knew Harold would be awake and having his breakfast. She had met him several times during neighborhood gatherings and hoped he would remember her as Audrey's friend. "Jessica, isn't it?" Harold said when he opened the door, his weathered face creasing into a genuine smile. "You're the young lady who comes to visit Audrey. What brings you by so early?" "Mr. Zimmerman, I'm really worried about Audrey." Jessica began carefully. "Her parents told me she went on a camping trip, but something doesn't feel right about their story. I was wondering if you might have noticed anything unusual at their house over the past couple of days." Harold's expression grew more serious as he invited Jessica inside and offered her a cup of coffee. His kitchen window provided a clear view of our backyard, and Jessica could see the basement window that corresponded to the storage area where I was being held. "Now that you mention it," Harold said thoughtfully, "I have noticed some strange things lately. Sounds coming from their basement area at odd hours, usually late at night or very early in the morning. Kind of rhythmic, like someone tapping on pipes." Jessica's pulse quickened. "What kind of tapping?" "Well, it's probably nothing," Harold continued. "But it reminded me of distress signals we used to practice in the Navy. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Could just be their plumbing acting up, but the timing seemed too regular for mechanical problems." The SOS pattern confirmed Jessica's worst fears, but it also provided the evidence she needed to convince Harold that something serious was happening. She explained her growing suspicions about Audrey's disappearance, the contradictory stories from Linda, and the surveillance she had conducted the previous night. Harold listened with the careful attention of someone accustomed to solving electrical problems through methodical troubleshooting. When Jessica finished her account, he was quiet for several minutes, processing the information and considering his options. "You mentioned my security cameras," he said finally. "I installed them about 6 months ago after someone broke into the Hendersons' garage. They cover most of my backyard, but they also pick up activity around the edges of the neighboring properties." He led Jessica to his small home office where a computer monitor displayed feeds from 4 different cameras positioned around his house. The system was more sophisticated than Jessica had expected, with high-definition recording capabilities and motion-activated alerts that captured activity at any time of day or night. Let me check the footage from the past few days. Harold said, navigating through the system's interface with surprising technical proficiency. If something happened at their house, we might have caught it on camera. They started with the most recent recordings and worked backward through time. The first several hours showed normal backyard activity: birds visiting Harold's feeders, a neighbor walking their dog along the fence line, and delivery trucks making their rounds through the neighborhood. But as they delved deeper into the archived footage, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The cameras had captured several instances over the past few months of unusual nighttime activity around our basement area. The footage showed Robert carrying what appeared to be heavy bundles from the house to the basement entrance, always during late-night hours when the neighborhood was asleep. "I thought he was just taking stuff to storage," Harold murmured, his voice growing troubled as we reviewed the recordings. But looking at it now, those bundles were about the size and weight of a person. The most recent footage from 3 nights earlier showed Robert clearly carrying my unconscious body from the house to the basement. The timestamp indicated it was just after 10 o'clock in the evening, consistent with when I would have been drugged during dinner. But the truly horrifying discovery came when Harold expanded the search parameters to include the previous 6 months of recordings. The cameras had been inadvertently documenting a pattern of abuse that stretched back much further than either Jessica or Harold had imagined. "My God," Harold whispered as we reviewed footage from different dates showing the same disturbing pattern. "This has been going on for months. How many times has he done this to her?" The security system had captured at least 6 separate instances of Robert carrying what was obviously my unconscious body to the basement, with intervals of several weeks between each incident. The footage also showed Linda's role in the operation, as she could be seen helping to coordinate the activities and maintaining surveillance, while Robert handled the physical aspects of my imprisonment. "We have to call the police immediately," Jessica said, reaching for her phone. Harold nodded grimly, but then paused as another thought occurred to him. "Wait, let me check something else first." He navigated to the most recent footage and enhanced the image quality around our basement window area. What they saw made Jessica gasp in horror. The window that should have provided natural light to the basement storage area was completely covered with what appeared to be thick, black plastic sheeting, effectively creating a soundproof and lightproof prison. The professional installation suggested this wasn't a temporary measure, but a permanent modification designed specifically for holding someone captive. "This is kidnapping," Harold said quietly, the full implications of what they had discovered settling over both of them. "This is a torture chamber they've built in their own basement." As they prepared to contact emergency services, Harold made one more disturbing discovery in the footage archive. The cameras had also captured conversations between Robert and Linda in their backyard, including discussions about their plans for my future and their satisfaction with the results of their psychological conditioning program. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. My parents weren't just controlling or misguided. They were criminals who had been systematically torturing me for months while maintaining a perfect facade of suburban respectability. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he navigated deeper into his security system's archive, following Jessica's suggestion to examine footage from earlier dates. What they discovered in the historical recordings was far worse than either of them had imagined possible. "Sweet Jesus," Harold whispered as a recording from 4 months earlier played on his computer screen. "This isn't the first time. Look at the timestamp on this one." The footage clearly showed Robert carrying my limp body to the basement entrance on a cold February night, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this routine multiple times. Linda stood watch at the back door, scanning the neighboring yards to ensure their activities went unobserved. Jessica watched in horrified fascination as Harold pulled up recording after recording, spanning the past 6 months. Each incident followed the same disturbing pattern: nighttime transport to the basement, several days of no visible activity around the window area, then eventual emergence of what appeared to be a confused and disoriented person, being helped back into the house. February 15th, March 22nd, April 18th. Harold read the timestamps aloud. May 30th, July 7th, and now this current one. They've been doing this to her regularly like some kind of scheduled treatment. The February recording was particularly chilling because it captured audio along with video. Harold's system had sensitive microphones that picked up conversations from the neighboring yards, and on that night, Robert and Linda had been discussing their activities in detail. "She'll be more cooperative after this session," Linda's voice was clearly audible, saying. The last one really improved her attitude about the job search restrictions. Robert's response was equally disturbing. 3 days should be sufficient. We don't want to cause permanent damage, just enough discomfort to reinforce the lessons we're trying to teach. The casual way they discussed my torture made it clear this wasn't impulsive abuse, born of anger or frustration. This was a calculated psychological conditioning program designed to break down my resistance and make me grateful for their control. Jessica felt sick as she listened to my parents planning my suffering with the same tone they might use to discuss weekend plans or grocery shopping. The recordings revealed the depth of their manipulation and the scientific approach they were taking to psychological torture. "There's more," Harold said grimly, pulling up additional footage from different camera angles. "Look at this recording from March." The March footage showed something even more disturbing than the transport sequences. Harold's cameras had captured Robert setting up equipment in our backyard, including what appeared to be a portable generator and several electronic devices that he carried to the basement entrance. "What is all that stuff?" Jessica asked. Harold enhanced the image quality and zoomed in on the equipment. "That's a video camera and lighting setup. Professional quality from the looks of it, and that device there is a motion sensor or some kind of monitoring equipment." The implications were staggering. Robert wasn't just imprisoning me in the basement, he was documenting the entire process with sophisticated recording equipment. The generator would provide power for extended filming sessions, and the monitoring devices would allow him to observe my condition remotely. "He's been filming everything." Jessica realized her voice barely above a whisper. "All those sessions, all that torture, he's been recording it." Harold pulled up more recent footage that showed Robert removing the same equipment after each session, carefully packing everything away and storing it somewhere in the house. The documentation wasn't just for their own reference, it was building a comprehensive library of my responses to their psychological conditioning. But the most shocking discovery came when Harold accessed footage from the previous week, before my current imprisonment began. The cameras had captured a conversation between Robert and Linda that revealed the true scope of their plans. "The lawyer says we have enough evidence now," Linda could be heard saying as she and Robert worked in their garden. 6 months of documented episodes should be sufficient to establish the pattern of instability." Robert's response chilled Jessica to the bone. "And if the guardianship petition doesn't work, we can always arrange for something more permanent. The insurance policies are substantial enough to make it worthwhile." The casual mention of insurance policies in the context of their abuse campaign suggested that Robert and Linda weren't just planning to control my life. They were considering ending it entirely if legal control proved insufficient. Harold immediately stopped the playback and reached for his phone. "We need to call the police right now. This has gone far beyond abuse into attempted murder territory." But Jessica held up her hand, pointing to the timestamp on the footage. "Wait, look at when this conversation happened. This was recorded 6 days ago, right before Audrey disappeared. They were planning this specific session as possibly the final one. The timing meant that my current imprisonment might be intended as something far more permanent than the previous sessions. If Robert and Linda had decided that legal guardianship was taking too long or might not succeed, they could be planning to eliminate the problem entirely by allowing me to die of dehydration or starvation in their basement. "How long can someone survive without food and water?" Jessica asked frantically. Harold's military background gave him knowledge he wished he didn't have. "Depends on conditions and health, but in a cold basement without water, maybe a week at most. With the small amounts they've been giving her, probably longer. But we're talking about serious organ damage if this goes on much longer." As they prepared to contact emergency services, Harold made one final discovery that would prove crucial to building a case against my parents. His system had automatically backed up all footage to a cloud storage service, creating an unalterable record of their crimes that couldn't be destroyed or suppressed. "This evidence is ironclad," Harold said as he copied the most damaging recordings to a secure drive. "Timestamps, audio, video, multiple incidents over months. No lawyer in the world can explain this away." The footage didn't just document my abuse, it revealed a systematic campaign of psychological torture, planned and executed by two people who were supposed to love and protect me. The recordings would provide prosecutors with everything they needed to pursue serious criminal charges and ensure that Robert and Linda could never hurt me or anyone else again. But first, they had to make sure I survived long enough to see justice served. Harold's call to 911 was answered by emergency dispatch operator Sarah Collins, who began collecting information according to standard protocols for wellness check requests. 911, what is your emergency? I need to report a kidnapping in progress. Harold said, his voice steady despite the urgency of the situation. My neighbor has been holding her adult daughter captive in their basement for several days, possibly longer. Sir, can you provide the address where this is allegedly occurring? Harold gave our house number on Maple Street and tried to convey the seriousness of the situation. I have video evidence showing the victim being carried unconscious to the basement multiple times over several months. This is not a family dispute. This is criminal imprisonment and torture. Jessica could hear the operator's responses becoming more cautious as Harold described the surveillance footage and the systematic nature of the abuse. Standard protocols for domestic disputes didn't cover situations where parents were allegedly torturing their adult children, and the operator seemed unsure how to categorize the emergency. Sir, I'm dispatching officers to the location, but I need you to understand that family conflicts often involve complex dynamics that may not be apparent to outside observers. This is not a family conflict, Harold insisted. I have recordings of them discussing insurance policies and permanent solutions. They are planning to kill this young woman. The mention of potential homicide triggered a more serious response, and Operator Collins began dispatching multiple units to our address while keeping Harold on the line to gather additional details about the evidence he had collected. Meanwhile, Jessica was experiencing her own frustration as she attempted to provide supporting information to the responding units. When she called the non-emergency police line to report my suspicious disappearance, she discovered that Linda had already been several steps ahead of them. "We have a report from yesterday morning about Audrey Stevens," the desk sergeant told Jessica. Her mother called to file a missing person report stating that her daughter left home voluntarily for a camping trip but failed to check in as promised. Mrs. Stevens provided evidence of her daughter's history of mental health struggles and impulsive behavior. Jessica felt her stomach drop as she realized the scope of Linda's preparation. What kind of evidence? Documentation from therapists, records of erratic employment history, and statements from the family indicating ongoing concerns about the daughter's emotional stability. Mrs. Stevens was very cooperative and seemed genuinely concerned about her daughter's welfare. The false missing person report was a masterstroke of manipulative planning. Linda had proactively established herself as the concerned parent, dealing with a troubled adult child, creating a narrative that would make any accusations against her appear to be the delusions of an unstable person. "Have you contacted any of the friends who were supposedly on this camping trip?" Jessica asked. Mrs. Stevens provided names, but she explained that her daughter often exaggerated her social connections. We found that adults with mental health issues sometimes claim to have plans or relationships that don't actually exist. Jessica was horrified to realize that Linda had anticipated every possible line of investigation and had prepared responses that would discredit any attempts to expose the truth. The false missing person report wasn't just covering up my current imprisonment. It was laying the groundwork for explaining my eventual disappearance or death as the tragic result of mental illness and poor decision-making. When Officer Martinez arrived at Harold's house to review the security footage, he initially approached the situation with the skepticism that Linda's preemptive report had been designed to create. His training and experience had taught him that family disputes often generated exaggerated accusations from well-meaning but misinformed neighbors. Mr. Zimmerman, I understand you have concerns about activity at the Stevens residence, Officer Martinez said as Harold led him to the computer setup. Before we review any recordings, I want you to know that Mrs. Stevens has already filed a missing person report and provided substantial documentation about her daughter's mental health challenges. Harold's response was to simply press play on the most recent footage showing Robert carrying my unconscious body to the basement. Then explain this, he said quietly. Officer Martinez watched the recording in growing alarm as the implications became clear. The timestamp showed the transport occurring after Linda had filed her missing person report, proving that she had lied to police while actively participating in my imprisonment. Do you have additional footage? Officer Martinez asked, his demeanor shifting from skepticism to professional intensity. Harold played recording after recording, building a comprehensive timeline of abuse that spanned months and included clear audio of Robert and Linda discussing their torture techniques and future plans. By the time they reached the conversation about insurance policies and permanent solutions, Officer Martinez was already radioing for backup units and a supervisor to respond to what was clearly a serious felony in progress. We need to approach this situation carefully, Officer Martinez explained as additional units arrived. If the victim is actually being held in the basement, any confrontation could escalate the situation and put her in immediate danger. The tactical considerations were complicated by the fact that Robert and Linda had been maintaining normal work schedules throughout my imprisonment. Linda was currently showing houses to prospective buyers, while Robert was at his office processing insurance claims. Their ability to continue their professional activities while holding me captive demonstrated a level of compartmentalization that suggested dangerous psychological profiles. How do we know she's still alive? Jessica asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in all of their minds. Officer Martinez reviewed the most recent footage, which showed no activity around the basement area for over 12 hours. We need to assume she's still viable and proceed accordingly. If we're wrong, this becomes a homicide investigation, but right now we're treating it as a rescue operation. The decision was made to approach the house immediately using Harold's footage as probable cause for emergency entry. Additional units were dispatched to locate and detain Robert and Linda at their respective workplaces, preventing them from returning home during the search and rescue operation. As the emergency vehicles assembled on Maple Street, Harold made one final discovery that added urgency to an already desperate situation. His motion-activated cameras had detected some activity around our basement window area earlier that morning, but the movement was so minimal that the system had barely registered it. Harold pointed to a barely visible disturbance in the plastic covering the basement window. Something moved behind that covering about 6 hours ago, but it was very slight. Could be the victim trying to signal, or it could be indicating deteriorating vital signs. Officer Martinez understood the implication. After 3 days of imprisonment without adequate food or water, my ability to move or signal for help would be severely compromised. The minimal movement detected by Harold's cameras might represent my last reserves of strength being used in a final attempt to communicate with the outside world. We go in now. Officer Martinez decided, coordinating with the tactical team that had just arrived. Every minute we wait could be the difference between rescue and recovery. Officer Martinez approached our front door with 2 backup units positioned around the perimeter of the house, while a tactical team prepared to breach the basement entrance if necessary. Harold's video evidence had provided them with probable cause for emergency entry, but they still needed to follow proper procedures to ensure any evidence collected would be admissible in court. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, its cheerful chime creating in surreal contrast with the gravity of the situation. Linda answered almost immediately, suggesting she had been watching for visitors or had seen the police vehicles assembling outside. "Officers, what can I do for you?" Linda asked, her real estate training evident in the professional warmth of her greeting. She was impeccably dressed despite having supposedly spent the morning showing houses her makeup perfect, and her smile conveying just the right amount of helpful concern. "Ma'am, we're here regarding the missing person report you filed yesterday about your daughter Audrey." Officer Martinez began carefully. "We have some additional questions and would like to search the premises to rule out any possibility that she might be here." Linda's expression shifted to one of maternal worry mixed with slight confusion. "Of course, officers. I'm happy to cooperate in any way that might help find Audrey, but I can assure you she's not here. As I explained when I filed the report, she left for a camping trip several days ago." "We understand that's your account of events," Officer Martinez replied. "However, we've received information suggesting that your daughter might actually be on the premises, specifically in the basement area." The mention of the basement caused the first crack in Linda's composed facade, a brief flicker of surprise that she quickly covered with increased concern. The basement. Why would anyone think she's in the basement? That's just storage space in our furnace area. Officer Martinez had been watching Linda's micro-expressions, carefully drawing on years of experience, interviewing subjects who were attempting to deceive law enforcement. Her response to the basement question had been exactly the kind of controlled surprise that indicated guilty knowledge. "Ma'am, we have evidence suggesting that your daughter has been held against her will in your basement for the past several days," he stated, directly watching for her reaction. Linda's training in handling difficult real estate negotiations served her well as she processed this direct challenge to her carefully constructed narrative. "Officers, I think there's been some kind of terrible misunderstanding. My daughter has been struggling with mental health issues lately, and I'm concerned that she might have told someone a confused or distorted version of recent events." She invited the officers inside and continued her explanation as they entered the foyer. "Audrey has been having episodes where she loses track of time and becomes disoriented. She's been receiving treatment, but the process has been challenging for our whole family. The house was immaculate, decorated in the same suburban perfection that Linda projected in her professional life. Family photos line the hallway showing years of Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies, and vacation trips that told the story of a loving, successful family. We'd like to search the basement area," Officer Martinez stated, firmly cutting through Linda's attempt to control the narrative. "Of course," Linda replied, immediately leading them toward the basement door. "Though I'm not sure what you expect to find down there. We mostly use it for storage and laundry." As they descended the stairs into the main basement area, everything appeared exactly as Linda had described. The finished portion of the basement contained a washer and dryer, several storage shelves with neatly organized seasonal items, and a small workshop area that Robert used for home improvement projects. "This is our main storage area," Linda explained, gesturing around the space. "As you can see, there's nothing unusual here." But Officer Martinez had studied Harold's footage carefully and knew they needed to access the unfinished storage area behind the furnace. "Ma'am, we need to check all areas of the basement, including the space behind the furnace." Linda's hesitation was brief but noticeable. "Oh, that's just a cramped storage area where we keep old furniture and holiday decorations. I don't think anyone would want to spend time back there." Officer Martinez pushed past her and made his way toward the rear of the basement, using his flashlight to illuminate the narrow space behind the furnace. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his career. I was barely conscious when the light from his flashlight found me slumped against the concrete wall in a position that suggested I had been trying to reach the water pipes above my head. The zip ties had cut deep welts into my wrists and ankles from days of struggling against the restraints. My lips were cracked and bleeding. My clothing was soiled, and my eyes were sunken from severe dehydration. Jesus Christ. Officer Martinez whispered, immediately calling for emergency medical services while beginning to cut my restraints with tools from his utility belt. The basement setup was exactly as Harold's footage had suggested, a professionally constructed prison designed for long-term human captivity. The chain bolted to the support beam, the covered window, and the concrete floor all demonstrated premeditation and planning that went far beyond impulsive family discipline. But the most damning evidence was the video equipment that Robert had forgotten to remove after his last session. The camera was still positioned on its cardboard box stand, pointed directly at the area where I had been chained. The device's memory card would later reveal hours of footage documenting my suffering and their techniques for psychological torture. As paramedics worked to stabilize my condition and prepare me for transport to the hospital, Officer Martinez confronted Linda with the undeniable evidence of her crimes. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and conspiracy," he announced, beginning the Miranda warning process. Linda's final attempt at manipulation was perhaps her most chilling performance yet. Even with the evidence surrounding her, and my barely conscious form being loaded onto a stretcher, she maintained her narrative of concerned maternal care. "Officers, you don't understand," she said, her voice carrying genuine emotion that made her words even more disturbing. "Everything we've done has been for Audrey's own good. She was spiraling out of control, making dangerous decisions that could have destroyed her future. Sometimes parents have to make difficult choices to protect their children." The complete absence of remorse or recognition that she had committed serious crimes demonstrated the depth of her psychological disorder. Linda genuinely believed that torturing me was an act of love, that systematically destroying my independence and dignity was her parental duty. But her carefully constructed world began to collapse when Officer Martinez revealed the most devastating evidence against her. "Mrs. Stevens, we have video recordings of you and your husband discussing insurance policies and permanent solutions for your daughter. We have footage of multiple instances where she was drugged and imprisoned in this basement. We have audio recordings of you planning her psychological torture." For the first time since the officers had arrived, Linda's composed facade cracked completely. The mention of recorded evidence that couldn't be explained away or recontextualized triggered a panic response that revealed the calculating predator beneath her maternal mask. "You can't have recordings," she said, her voice rising with genuine alarm. "We were careful. We checked for cameras." The admission that they had been careful and checked for surveillance equipment proved their consciousness of guilt and premeditation. Linda had just confirmed that she and Robert knew their actions were criminal and had taken steps to avoid detection. But the final blow came when backup officers arrived with Robert in custody, having arrested him at his office based on the evidence Harold had provided. Robert's response to being confronted with the video footage was completely different from Linda's calculated resistance. "It was all her idea," Robert blurted out as soon as he saw Linda in handcuffs. "She planned everything. She researched the legal procedures, she found the lawyers, she designed the whole psychological conditioning program. I just did what she told me to do." The collapse of their united front revealed the true power dynamic in their relationship and the extent of Linda's manipulation. Robert's confession provided prosecutors with detailed information about their methods, their timeline, and their ultimate goals for gaining complete control over my life and assets. As I was rushed to the hospital with Jessica holding my hand in the ambulance, Linda's perfect suburban facade finally crumbled, completely revealing the calculating predator who had been systematically destroying my life while presenting herself as the ideal mother and neighbor. The emergency room at Denver General Hospital became a flurry of coordinated activity as paramedics rushed my gurney through the automatic doors. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the attending physician, took one look at my condition and immediately began barking orders to the trauma team. "Severe dehydration, possible kidney damage, signs of prolonged restraint trauma," she announced as nurses began establishing IV lines and monitoring equipment. How long was she held without adequate water and nutrition? "At least 3 days for this episode," Jessica answered, staying close to my side despite the medical chaos surrounding us. But we have evidence suggesting this has been happening repeatedly for months. My blood pressure was dangerously low, and my body temperature had dropped significantly from prolonged exposure to the cold basement environment. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize my vital signs while running tests to assess the full extent of the damage my parents had inflicted. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the hospital within an hour carrying a thick folder of evidence that Harold's security footage and my parents' arrests had generated. She was a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department's domestic violence unit, but even her extensive experience with family abuse cases hadn't prepared her for the systematic nature of what Robert and Linda had orchestrated. Miss Stevens, I know you're exhausted, but we need to document your account of what happened while the details are still fresh, Detective Chen said gently as I drifted in and out of consciousness. Take your time, but anything you can tell us will help ensure your parents face appropriate consequences. As the IV fluids began restoring my cognitive function, I was able to provide a chronological account of my imprisonment that corroborated the evidence Harold's cameras had captured. But the most crucial revelation came when I remembered the hidden documentation I had been secretly collecting for weeks before my final imprisonment. There's a phone, I whispered to Detective Chen, hidden in my bedroom behind the loose baseboard near my desk. I've been recording their conversations whenever I could. Jessica volunteered to accompany police to retrieve the device while I continued receiving medical treatment. What they discovered in my bedroom was a testament to my growing awareness that my parents were planning something catastrophic. The hidden phone contained dozens of audio recordings dating back 6 weeks, capturing conversations between Robert and Linda that revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise. My weakened fingers had managed to activate the recording app whenever I sensed they were discussing their plans, creating a comprehensive audio library of their conspiracy. The guardianship petition should be approved within 90 days. Linda's voice was clearly audible on one recording. Once we have legal authority, we can liquidate her assets and relocate somewhere more remote. Robert's response was equally damning, and if the petition gets denied, we move to option 2. The life insurance policies are worth more than the inheritance anyway, and accidental death during a mental health crisis would be completely believable. The recordings revealed that my parents weren't just planning to control my life through legal guardianship. They had developed a comprehensive scheme to steal my inheritance from my grandmother's estate, liquidate my personal assets, and potentially murder me if legal control proved insufficient. But the most chilling discovery was a recording from just 2 weeks earlier, where Linda discussed their timeline for implementing what she called the final solution. The basement sessions have been effective for short-term compliance, but we need something more permanent, Linda could be heard saying. The next intervention should be extended until we achieve complete psychological breakdown. Once she's genuinely incapacitated, the guardianship becomes a medical necessity rather than a legal maneuver. Detective Chen listened to hours of recordings with growing amazement at the level of premeditation and psychological sophistication my parents had employed. This wasn't typical domestic abuse or even financial elder abuse. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign that combined psychological torture, legal manipulation, and potential homicide. Your parents had been planning this for over a year, Detective Chen explained as I gradually regained strength. They researched adult guardianship laws, consulted with corrupt medical professionals about false diagnoses, and even purchased property in rural Montana where they planned to relocate with you under legal guardianship. The Montana property discovery was particularly disturbing because it revealed the geographical component of their plan. They had chosen an isolated location where my eventual disappearance or death would be difficult to investigate and where they could continue their abuse without interference from neighbors or local authorities. But Detective Chen had saved the most shocking revelation for last. Miss Stevens, during our investigation into your parents' activities, we discovered evidence connecting them to another case from 20 years ago, she said carefully. Your father's sister, Patricia, died under suspicious circumstances in 1995, and the similarities to your situation are too significant to ignore. She showed me copies of old police reports documenting Patricia's death, which had been ruled a suicide despite physical evidence that suggested prolonged confinement and abuse. Patricia had made claims to authorities about family members trying to control her finances and isolate her from friends, but those reports had been dismissed as the paranoid delusions of someone suffering from mental illness. Patricia Stevens was 24 when she died, approximately the same age you are now, Detective Chen continued. She had recently inherited a substantial sum from her grandmother's estate, just like your recent inheritance. The family claimed she was emotionally unstable and unable to manage her affairs independently. The parallels were unmistakable and terrifying. My parents had successfully murdered Robert's sister 2 decades earlier, using the same psychological torture techniques they had been perfecting on me. Patricia's death had provided them with both financial gain and valuable experience in manipulating the legal system to avoid prosecution. We're reopening Patricia's case as a homicide investigation, Detective Chen informed me. Your survival and the evidence you collected may finally bring justice for your aunt and prevent your parents from hurting anyone else. The realization that I had barely escaped the same fate that had befallen Patricia 20 years earlier was overwhelming. My parents weren't just abusive or controlling, they were serial killers who had been using family relationships to identify and eliminate victims whose deaths would generate both financial benefits and minimal investigation. As I processed this information, Dr. Chen returned with updates on my medical condition that provided additional evidence of my parents' crimes. Miss Stevens, your blood work shows traces of several sedative medications that would have been administered repeatedly over an extended period, Dr. Chen explained. The pattern is consistent with someone being drugged regularly for months, which explains the memory gaps and confusion you've been experiencing. The medical evidence corroborated my account of being subjected to multiple basement imprisonments that I couldn't remember clearly. My parents had been systematically drugging me and erasing my memories of their torture sessions, leaving me to wonder why I felt so disoriented and unstable without understanding the true cause of my symptoms. Jessica sat beside my hospital bed as the full scope of my parents' crimes became clear, holding my hand and providing the emotional support that would be crucial for my recovery and healing. "You're safe now," Jessica said quietly. "They can never hurt you again, and you're going to make sure they pay for everything they've done to you and to Patricia." For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope mixed with determination. I had survived my parents' attempt to destroy me, and now I had the opportunity to ensure they faced justice for their crimes while helping other potential victims recognize and escape similar situations. The next 72 hours in the hospital passed in a carefully monitored blur of medical tests, police interviews, and visits from the growing team of professionals who were building the case against my parents. Dr. Chen had insisted on keeping me under observation to monitor for potential organ damage from the prolonged dehydration and malnutrition. But my body was responding well to treatment and showing signs of steady improvement. Jessica had barely left my side, coordinating with my medical team and serving as my advocate during the constant stream of interviews with law enforcement officers. Harold visited daily, bringing flowers and updates on the neighborhood's reaction to the discovery that a torture chamber had been operating in what everyone had assumed was the perfect family home on Maple Street. "The whole street is in shock," Harold told me during one of his visits. "People are questioning how they could have lived so close to something so terrible without recognizing what was happening." Detective Chen had been working around the clock to build what she described as an airtight case against Robert and Linda, but her investigation had uncovered disturbing information that added new urgency to their prosecution. "Miss Stevens, we've discovered that your parents weren't just planning to relocate to Montana," Detective Chen informed me during one of our sessions. "They had already put your childhood home on the market and were scheduled to close on the sale next week. The timeline was chilling in its implications. My parents had been just days away from liquidating their Denver assets and disappearing with me to a remote location where my torture and eventual murder could have been completed without interference from neighbors or local authorities who knew my history. The Montana property they purchased is completely isolated, Detective Chen continued. The nearest neighbor is over 5 miles away, and the local sheriff's department consists of 2 part-time deputies covering a county larger than some states. If they had succeeded in relocating you there, it might have been months or even years before anyone noticed you were missing. The real estate transactions revealed the sophisticated financial planning that had gone into their criminal enterprise. Linda had been using her professional connections to identify properties that would serve their purposes while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate retirement relocation. But the investigation had also revealed a more immediate concern that required urgent legal intervention. Your parents had been systematically transferring assets out of accounts that should have been inaccessible to them. Detective Chen explained, showing me bank statements and legal documents that painted a picture of extensive financial fraud. Robert had been using his position as my emergency contact on various accounts to gain unauthorized access to my inheritance from my grandmother's estate. Over the past 6 months, he had been making small withdrawals that individually appeared legitimate, but collectively represented a significant theft of my financial resources. They've stolen approximately $80,000 from accounts that were legally yours, Detective Chen said. The money was transferred to offshore accounts that would have been accessible after they relocated to Montana. The financial crime added another layer of serious charges to their already extensive list of felonies, but it also complicated my immediate situation. With my parents in custody and their assets frozen pending investigation, I needed to quickly establish financial independence and secure legal representation for both the criminal prosecution and the civil recovery of my stolen assets. This challenge led to an unexpected meeting with attorney Michael Harrison, a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, who'd been assigned to coordinate the various charges against my parents. Attorney Harrison had extensive experience with family exploitation cases, but he told me frankly that my situation was unique in both its sophistication and its brutality. I've been prosecuting financial abuse cases for 12 years, but I've never seen anything this systematically planned and executed, Attorney Harrison said during our first meeting. Your parents created a comprehensive criminal enterprise that combined psychological torture, legal fraud, and planned homicide. He outlined the prosecution strategy that would seek maximum sentences for both Robert and Linda, while ensuring that their convictions would prevent them from ever being eligible for parole or early release. We're charging them with kidnapping, aggravated assault, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree murder in the death of Patricia Stevens, Attorney Harrison explained. If convicted on all charges, they're looking at life sentences without possibility of parole. But the most significant development came when Attorney Harrison informed me about a discovery that had emerged during the search of my parents' house. Miss Stevens, we found evidence that your parents had been researching other potential victims beyond yourself and Patricia, he said carefully. They had compiled detailed files on several young adults in similar circumstances, people with recent inheritances, limited family support, and vulnerability to financial and psychological manipulation. The investigation had uncovered what appeared to be a target list of potential future victims, complete with personal information, financial assessments, and psychological profiles. My parents hadn't just been planning to murder me. They had been developing a systematic approach to identifying and exploiting vulnerable young adults for financial gain. How many people were on their list? I asked, feeling sick at the thought that other families might be enduring what I had survived. 14 names, Attorney Harrison replied grimly. We've contacted all of them to warn them about potential danger and gather information about any suspicious contact they may have had with your parents. The scope of their criminal planning was staggering. Robert and Linda had been operating what amounted to a serial killing enterprise disguised as family concern, using Robert's insurance industry contacts and Linda's real estate network to identify potential targets and develop approaches for gaining their trust. As I absorbed this information, Dr. Chen arrived with news that would mark a turning point in both my physical recovery and my determination to see justice served. Miss Stevens, your medical tests show that you've made remarkable progress, Dr. Chen announced. Your kidney function is returning to normal and there don't appear to be any permanent physical effects from your ordeal. You should be able to be discharged tomorrow. The prospect of leaving the hospital and beginning to rebuild my life was both exciting and terrifying. I would be returning to a world where my parents were in custody and my childhood home was a crime scene, but where I would finally have the opportunity to reclaim control over my own existence. Jessica had already begun researching temporary housing options and had volunteered to help me navigate the practical challenges of re-establishing independence while the legal proceedings moved forward. "You're not going through this alone," Jessica assured me. "We're going to make sure you have all the support you need to heal and to see your parents punished for their crimes." As I prepared for discharge, I made a decision that would shape my approach to recovery and justice. I was going to use my survival and the evidence I had gathered to ensure that Robert and Linda faced the full consequences of their actions, while also working to help other potential victims recognize and escape similar situations before they could be harmed. My release from the hospital marked the beginning of what Attorney Harrison described as the most complex prosecution his office had ever undertaken. The evidence against my parents was overwhelming in its volume and disturbing in its content, but building a case that would ensure maximum sentences required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations. I moved into a temporary apartment that Jessica helped me secure using funds that Detective Chen had managed to recover from my parents' initial asset transfers. The space was small and simply furnished, but it represented something I hadn't experienced in months: complete freedom to control my own environment and make my own decisions without fear of surveillance or manipulation. The first major breakthrough in building the case came when forensic accountants completed their analysis of Robert and Linda's financial records. What they discovered was evidence of a criminal enterprise that stretched back much further than anyone had initially suspected. "Miss Stevens, your parents have been operating this scheme for over 2 decades. Detective Chen informed me during one of our regular case update meetings. "We've identified at least 6 potential victims besides yourself and Patricia, and the pattern suggests they may have been successful in several instances." The financial records revealed suspicious insurance payouts and inheritance transfers dating back to the mid-1990s, all involving young adults who had died under circumstances that were ruled accidental or suicide, but showed patterns consistent with what I had experienced. Each case involved someone in their 20s with a recent inheritance or substantial life insurance policy. Detective Chen continued. The deaths occurred after periods of documented mental health struggles that in hindsight appear to have been artificially created through psychological manipulation. The scope of my parents' crimes was far greater than anyone had imagined. They had been perfecting their techniques for identifying, isolating, and eliminating vulnerable victims for over 20 years, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims and stolen inheritances. But the investigation took a shocking turn when Detective Chen received a call from authorities in Montana regarding the property my parents had purchased for their planned relocation. "Miss Stevens, I need to prepare you for some difficult information," Detective Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of another disturbing discovery. "Local authorities in Montana found human remains on the property your parents bought." The remote Montana location hadn't just been intended as a place to continue my torture and eventual murder. It had been used as a disposal site for previous victims. Forensic teams were working to identify the remains and determine how many people my parents had killed over the years. How many, I asked, dreading the answer. at least 3 sets of remains so far, but the excavation is ongoing, Detective Chen replied. We believe your parents have been using that property as a burial site for victims whose deaths they couldn't easily disguise as accidents or suicides in populated areas. The discovery transformed my case from aggravated abuse to serial homicide, placing my parents among the most prolific family-based serial killers in modern American history. The media attention was becoming intense, but Attorney Harrison assured me that the prosecution team was prepared to handle the publicity while protecting my privacy during the legal proceedings. The most emotionally challenging aspect of building the case was reviewing the video evidence that Robert had been collecting during my basement imprisonments. Attorney Harrison had warned me that the footage was disturbing, but he needed my input to understand the full context of what had been recorded. You don't have to watch everything, Attorney Harrison said as we prepared for the evidence review session, but your ability to explain what was happening and what your parents were trying to accomplish will be crucial for helping the jury understand the systematic nature of their psychological torture. The videos were harder to watch than I had anticipated, showing my deterioration over multiple sessions and my parents' clinical approach to documenting my suffering. Robert's voice could be heard providing commentary about my responses and adjusting his techniques based on what he observed to be most effective in breaking down my resistance. This is Session 7. Robert's voice narrated on one particularly disturbing recording. The subject is showing increased compliance after 72 hours of isolation. Recommend extending future sessions to achieve more permanent attitude modification. The clinical language he used to describe my torture was reminiscent of legitimate psychological research, suggesting that Robert had been studying behavioral conditioning techniques and applying them to perfect his abuse methods. But the most damaging evidence against my parents came from an unexpected source, Linda's own documentation of their crimes. Your mother kept detailed records of every session, every technique, and every result, Detective Chen explained, showing me notebooks filled with Linda's handwriting. She approached your torture like a scientific experiment, tracking what methods were most effective and planning improvements for future sessions. Linda's notebooks contain detailed psychological profiles of all their victims, including analysis of personality traits that made people vulnerable to their manipulation techniques. She had been studying victimology and criminal psychology, using legitimate academic research to improve their ability to identify and exploit potential targets. She wrote about you specifically. Detective Chen continued reading from one of the notebooks. She identified your loyalty to family and your tendency to blame yourself for problems as weaknesses they could exploit. She planned every aspect of your psychological conditioning based on her analysis of your personality. The scientific approach Linda had taken to psychological torture was perhaps more disturbing than the abuse itself. She hadn't been acting out of anger or mental illness. She'd been conducting systematic research into how to destroy another person's will to resist while maintaining legal deniability. As the evidence continued to mount, my role in the prosecution expanded beyond simply being a victim providing testimony. Attorney Harrison asked me to help develop educational materials that could be used to train law enforcement officers and social workers to recognize similar patterns of family-based serial abuse. Your case is going to change how we investigate suspicious deaths involving young adults, Attorney Harrison told me. Your survival and the evidence you collected are going to save lives by helping professionals recognize these patterns before other families can be destroyed. The opportunity to contribute to preventing future crimes gave my survival a sense of purpose that was crucial for my psychological recovery. I wasn't just a victim who had escaped. I was someone whose experience could be used to protect others from suffering similar torture. But the preparation for trial also revealed one more shocking aspect of my parents' criminal enterprise that would prove crucial for securing their convictions: The months leading up to the trial were consumed with intensive preparation, as Attorney Harrison and his team built what he described as the most comprehensive family violence prosecution in Colorado legal history. The evidence against my parents filled multiple file cabinets and required specialized expertise from forensic psychologists, financial crimes investigators, and homicide detectives. My own preparation involved working with Dr. Amanda Foster, a trauma specialist, who helped me develop the emotional resilience necessary to testify about my experiences, while also processing the psychological damage my parents had inflicted. Dr. Foster explained that my testimony would be crucial, not just for securing convictions, but for helping the legal system understand the sophisticated nature of psychological torture techniques that most professionals had never encountered. Your parents used methods that are typically associated with military interrogation and cult indoctrination, Dr. Foster explained during one of our sessions. The systematic nature of their approach suggests they had been studying psychological warfare techniques and adapting them for their criminal purposes. The therapy sessions helped me understand that my survival wasn't just a matter of luck or physical endurance. I had demonstrated remarkable psychological resilience in the face of techniques designed to completely break down my sense of identity and self-worth. But the trial preparation took an unexpected turn when Detective Chen received a call from authorities in 3 different states reporting suspicious deaths that showed patterns similar to my parents' methods. Ms. Stevens, we believe your parents may have been traveling to other states to commit crimes when their local opportunities were limited, Detective Chen informed me. We're coordinating with law enforcement agencies in Nevada, Arizona, and Texas to investigate cases that might be connected to your parents' activities. The multi-state investigation revealed that Robert and Linda had been using vacation trips and real estate conferences as opportunities to identify and eliminate victims in locations where they had no known connections or motives. The scope of their criminal enterprise was far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. We're looking at potentially 15 to 20 murders, spanning 2 decades, Detective Chen continued. Your parents may be among the most prolific serial killers in American history, specializing in victims whose deaths would generate financial benefits while appearing to be accidents or suicides. The revelation that my parents were suspected in dozens of murders across multiple states brought national media attention to the case and attracted the involvement of federal law enforcement agencies. FBI behavioral analysts were brought in to develop profiles of my parents' methods and help identify additional potential victims. But the most significant development came just 6 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, when Linda's legal team attempted a strategy that would ultimately destroy any sympathy she might have garnered from potential jurors. Linda had hired attorney Rebecca Walsh, a high-profile defense lawyer who specialized in representing clients accused of family violence. Attorney Walsh's initial strategy appeared to be based on portraying Linda as a victim of Robert's psychological manipulation, claiming that she had been coerced into participating in crimes that were primarily planned and executed by her husband. Mrs. Stevens was also a victim of her husband's controlling and abusive behavior. Attorney Walsh announced during a press conference. She participated in activities that she now recognizes were wrong, but she was acting under duress and fear for her own safety. The domestic violence defense was sophisticated and might have been effective in generating sympathy from jurors, particularly given Linda's carefully cultivated image as a professional real estate agent and community volunteer. But Attorney Harrison had anticipated this strategy and had been preparing evidence that would demonstrate Linda's role as the primary architect of their criminal enterprise. We have recordings of conversations where Linda discusses her research into psychological torture techniques. Attorney Harrison explained to me. We have her notebooks showing detailed planning for victim selection and abuse methods. We have financial records showing she was the one managing the stolen assets and planning the relocation to Montana. The evidence clearly demonstrated that Linda hadn't been a reluctant participant in their crimes. She had been the primary planner and motivator who had convinced Robert to help her implement increasingly sophisticated schemes for identifying and eliminating victims. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when forensic analysis of the Montana burial site revealed evidence that Linda had personally participated in the disposal of bodies and the concealment of physical evidence. "Your mother wasn't just planning the crimes," Detective Chen told me. "She was actively involved in every aspect of their execution, including the cleanup and cover-up activities that allowed them to avoid detection for so many years." As the trial date approached, my own role in the proceedings became more complex than simply providing victim testimony. Attorney Harrison asked me to serve as a consultant to help the prosecution team understand the psychological techniques my parents had used and explain their effectiveness to jurors who had no experience with systematic abuse. Your ability to articulate what they were trying to accomplish and how their methods affected your thinking will be crucial for helping jurors understand the premeditated nature of their crimes, Attorney Harrison explained. "We need them to see that this wasn't impulsive violence or mental illness. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to achieve specific criminal objectives." The preparation process was emotionally exhausting, but also empowering as I developed a comprehensive understanding of how my parents had operated and why their techniques had been so effective in controlling and manipulating their victims. But the most important preparation came when I learned about Linda's final desperate attempt to avoid conviction by claiming that her actions had been motivated by genuine maternal concern for my welfare. "She's going to testify that everything she did was intended to help you develop better judgment and emotional stability," Attorney Harrison warned me. "She'll claim that the basement sessions were therapeutic interventions designed to help you overcome psychological problems that were preventing you from functioning independently." Linda's strategy was to present herself as a concerned mother who had used unconventional but well-intentioned methods to help her troubled adult daughter develop better life skills and emotional resilience. "That's exactly the kind of manipulation she used on me for months," I told Attorney Harrison. "She convinced me that my confusion and instability were my own fault when they were actually the result of her psychological torture and medication poisoning." My role in the trial would be to expose Linda's manipulative techniques and demonstrate how she had used my love and trust to facilitate my own abuse while presenting herself as the caring parent trying to help her struggling child. The trial was going to be my opportunity to finally confront my parents directly and expose the truth about their crimes to a jury that would decide their fate and determine whether they would ever have the opportunity to hurt anyone else again. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in February, with Attorney Harrison delivering an opening statement that laid out the full scope of my parents' criminal enterprise for the 12 jurors who would determine their fate. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, law enforcement officers from multiple jurisdictions, and family members of other suspected victims who had traveled to Denver hoping to finally see justice served. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Attorney Harrison began, "over the next several weeks, you will hear evidence of crimes so systematic and so brutal that they challenge our understanding of what human beings are capable of doing to their own family members." He outlined the prosecution's case, methodically explaining how Robert and Linda had spent over 2 decades perfecting techniques for identifying vulnerable victims, isolating them from support systems, and ultimately murdering them for financial gain, while making their deaths appear to be accidents or suicides. The defense attorneys attempted to portray their clients as loving parents who had made mistakes in their attempts to help their troubled daughter, but the overwhelming evidence made that narrative increasingly difficult to maintain as the trial progressed. Harold was the first witness to testify, describing his discovery of the security footage and his growing horror as he realized what had been happening in the house next door to him for months. His testimony was powerful because it came from a disinterested neighbor who had no motivation to fabricate evidence or exaggerate the severity of what he had observed. "I've lived on Maple Street for 30 years, Harold told the jury. I thought I knew my neighbors. I thought the Stevens family was exactly what they appeared to be, successful, caring people who were dealing with normal family challenges. I never imagined that Robert and Linda were operating a torture chamber in their basement." Detective Chen testified for 2 full days, walking the jury through the evidence that had been collected and explaining how the investigation had revealed the full scope of my parents' crimes. Her presentation included the security footage, the audio recordings from my hidden phone, and the financial records that documented years of systematic theft and fraud. But the most compelling evidence came from Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist who had analyzed my parents' methods and explained their techniques to the jury in language that non-experts could understand. The defendants employed sophisticated psychological warfare techniques that are typically associated with military interrogation and cult indoctrination. Dr. Williams explained, "These methods were specifically designed to break down the victim's sense of identity and self-worth while creating dependency on the abusers for basic survival needs." She used my case to illustrate how each component of my parents' system had been carefully designed to achieve specific psychological objectives, from the isolation techniques that eliminated my support network to the memory disruption caused by regular drugging sessions. "The basement imprisonments weren't random punishment," Dr. Williams continued. "They were precisely timed interventions designed to reinforce learned helplessness and prevent the victim from developing effective resistance strategies." When it was my turn to testify, I had prepared extensively with Attorney Harrison to ensure that my account would be clear, comprehensive, and emotionally powerful without being overwhelming for the jurors to process. "I want you to understand that my parents didn't become criminals overnight," I told the jury. "They spent months systematically destroying every aspect of my independence while presenting themselves as concerned parents who were trying to help me through a difficult period." I walked the jury through the timeline of my abuse, explaining how Robert and Linda had sabotaged my job, opportunities isolated me from friends, monitored my communications, and gradually escalated their control until I was completely dependent on them for survival. The most difficult part of my testimony was describing the basement imprisonments and the psychological techniques my parents had used to make me doubt my own perceptions and blame myself for the abuse I was experiencing. "They convinced me that my confusion and instability were signs of mental illness," I explained. "They made me believe that their intervention was necessary for my own safety and well-being. Even while I was chained in their basement, part of me wondered if they might be right about my need for this kind of correction." The jury listened with visible horror as I described the systematic nature of my psychological torture and the sophisticated methods my parents had used to document and refine their techniques over multiple sessions. But the turning point in the trial came when Linda took the stand in her own defense against the advice of her attorney. Attorney Walsh had warned her that testifying would expose her to cross-examination that could reveal the full extent of her manipulation and control. But Linda's narcissistic personality made it impossible for her to resist the opportunity to present her version of events. "Everything I did was motivated by love for my daughter." Linda testified, maintaining the same composed demeanor she had perfected during years of real estate presentations. Audrey was struggling with serious psychological problems that were preventing her from functioning independently. My husband and I consulted with professionals about intervention strategies that might help her develop better coping skills. Her testimony was smooth and practiced, presenting a narrative of concerned parents who had used unconventional but well-intentioned methods to help their troubled adult child overcome emotional and behavioral challenges. But Attorney Harrison's cross-examination exposed the calculating predator beneath Linda's maternal facade. "Mrs. Stevens, you testified that your actions were motivated by love for your daughter. Attorney Harrison began. "Can you explain how chaining her in a basement without food or water for 3 days demonstrates parental love? Linda's response revealed the depth of her psychological disorder and her complete lack of empathy for my suffering. Sometimes children need firm boundaries to understand the consequences of inappropriate behavior," Linda replied calmly. "Audrey had been defiant and disrespectful, making accusations against her family and refusing to accept the help we were offering. 3 days of reflection time was intended to help her develop better judgment." The casual way she discussed my torture horrified the jurors and demonstrated that she genuinely believed psychological abuse was an appropriate parenting technique. "Mrs. Stevens, did your intervention techniques include drugging your daughter without her knowledge?" Attorney Harrison continued. "We administered mild sedatives when her emotional state became dangerous to herself and others," Linda responded. "Medical intervention was necessary to prevent her from making impulsive decisions that could have resulted in serious harm." With each question, Linda revealed more of her twisted worldview and her complete inability to recognize the criminal nature of her actions. She described my imprisonment as therapeutic intervention, my psychological torture as behavior modification, and her plans for my murder as protective custody. The final blow came when Attorney Harrison played recordings of Linda discussing insurance policies and permanent solutions for dealing with me. "Mrs. Stevens, can you explain this conversation where you discuss the financial benefits of your daughter's death?" For the first time during her testimony, Linda showed signs of panic as she realized that her own words had provided undeniable evidence of her criminal intent. That conversation was taken out of context. She said, her voice rising with genuine alarm. "We were discussing hypothetical scenarios for protecting Audrey's assets if something happened to her." But the recordings were clear and unambiguous, revealing Linda's cold calculation about the financial advantages of murdering me compared to the complications of long-term legal guardianship. As Linda's composure finally cracked under the pressure of Attorney Harrison's methodical questioning, she revealed the narcissistic rage that had driven her crimes for over 2 decades. "You don't understand what it's like to sacrifice everything for an ungrateful child who refuses to appreciate the care and guidance you provide," Linda screamed at Attorney Harrison. "Children are supposed to honor and obey their parents, not make wild accusations and involve outsiders in private family matters." Her explosive outburst revealed the fundamental belief system that had motivated her crimes, the conviction that children were property to be controlled completely and disposed of if they proved insufficiently compliant. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges for both Robert and Linda. The evidence had been so overwhelming and Linda's testimony so damaging that there was no reasonable doubt about their guilt or the premeditated nature of their crimes. 6 months after the trial concluded, I stood in the visiting room of the Colorado State Penitentiary, looking through bulletproof glass at my mother for what would be the last time in my life. Linda had been sentenced to life without possibility of parole for her role as the primary architect of their criminal enterprise, while Robert had received a sentence of life with the possibility of parole after 25 years in exchange for his cooperation in identifying additional victims. "I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished," Linda said, her voice carrying the same manipulative tone she had used throughout my childhood. "You've destroyed your family and ruined the lives of people who loved you more than you'll ever understand." Even facing life in prison, Linda remained completely convinced that she had been the victim of my ingratitude and the justice system's failure to recognize her good intentions. Her inability to accept responsibility or show remorse confirmed that my decision to pursue maximum penalties had been correct. "I'm satisfied that you can never hurt anyone else the way you hurt me and Patricia and all the other people whose lives you destroyed," I replied calmly. "That's what justice looks like for someone like you." I left the prison that day knowing I would never return. Linda and Robert had no power over my life anymore, and I had no obligation to maintain contact with people who had spent years planning my torture and murder. My new life had taken shape gradually over the months following their conviction. The recovery of my stolen assets had provided financial stability, and the Victim Compensation Fund had covered the extensive therapy I needed to process the trauma of systematic abuse and rebuild my sense of identity and self-worth. I had moved into a spacious apartment in downtown Denver, far from the suburban neighborhood where my childhood home had been demolished to eliminate the crime scene that had attracted curiosity seekers and true crime enthusiasts. The insurance settlement from that property sale had been donated to organizations that help abuse survivors, ensuring that something positive emerged from the location where so much suffering had occurred. My graphic design business had flourished as I channeled my creative energy into projects that felt meaningful and fulfilling. Word of my survival and the justice we had achieved had spread through the design community, leading to clients who specifically wanted to support my recovery while benefiting from the unique perspective that surviving severe trauma had given me about resilience and human strength. Jessica remained my closest friend and business partner, helping me navigate the practical challenges of rebuilding while providing the emotional support that was crucial for my continued healing. Harold had become a surrogate grandfather figure, checking on me regularly and sharing meals when I needed company, but didn't feel ready for larger social gatherings. But the most meaningful aspect of my new life was the work I had begun with the Survivor Advocacy Network, an organization that helps people recognize and escape situations involving family-based abuse and financial exploitation. My experience with systematic psychological torture had given me insights that were valuable for helping other victims understand what was happening to them and develop strategies for documenting evidence while planning their escape. Your case changed how we investigate suspicious family dynamics, Detective Chen told me during one of our quarterly check-ins. Law enforcement agencies across the country are now trained to recognize the patterns you helped us identify, and we've prevented at least 12 attempted murders in cases that showed similarities to what your parents were doing. The knowledge that my survival and testimony had directly prevented other families from experiencing similar crimes gave my experience a sense of purpose that was crucial for my psychological recovery. I wasn't just someone who had escaped abuse. I was someone whose survival had made the world safer for other vulnerable people. My speaking engagements at conferences and training seminars had evolved into a second career that complemented my design work and allowed me to reach larger audiences with information about recognizing and resisting family-based exploitation. The talks were emotionally challenging, but they also provided opportunities to connect with other survivors and help them understand that recovery and justice were possible even after the most severe trauma. On a sunny afternoon in late autumn, I visited Patricia's grave for the first time since learning about her murder. The headstone was simple and dignified, marking the resting place of a young woman whose life had been cut short by the same predators who had tried to destroy me 2 decades later. I kept my promise, I said quietly, placing fresh flowers on her grave. They'll never hurt anyone else, and people know the truth about what they did to you. Your life mattered, and your death helped save others. The visit to Patricia's grave marked a milestone in my healing process, representing my ability to honor the memory of other victims while celebrating my own survival and the justice we had achieved together. As I drove home through the changing leaves of a Colorado autumn, I reflected on the life lessons that had emerged from my experience with systematic family abuse and my journey toward recovery and justice. Trust your instincts when people who claim to love you consistently undermine your independence and self-worth. Real love empowers you to grow and thrive. It never seeks to diminish or control you. The people closest to us can sometimes be the most dangerous, but there are always others willing to help if we have the courage to reach out and ask for assistance. Healing from deep betrayal is possible even when that betrayal comes from the people who were supposed to protect and nurture us. Recovery requires time, professional support, and the determination to rebuild our sense of identity and self-worth, but it can be accomplished with patience and commitment to our own well-being. Survivors of severe trauma have unique insights and strength that can be used to help others recognize and escape similar situations. Transforming our pain into purpose by protecting others gives our survival meaning and contributes to preventing future victims from experiencing what we endured. Justice may take time to achieve, but it's worth pursuing both for our own healing and for the protection of others who might be targeted by the same predators. The legal system isn't perfect, but it can be an effective tool for holding criminals accountable when we have the courage to use it and the support to see the process through to completion. Most importantly, no matter how systematic or sophisticated the abuse, we experience our fundamental worth and right to freedom can never be truly destroyed. Even in the darkest moments, even when we've been convinced that we're worthless or crazy or deserving of punishment, the truth about our value and dignity remains intact, waiting for us to rediscover and reclaim it. As I settled into my apartment that evening, I felt grateful for the life I had built and the people who had helped me escape the trap my parents had constructed. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to grow, create, and contribute to making the world safer for other vulnerable people who needed someone to believe their stories and help them find their way to freedom. Have you ever felt like someone in your family was trying to control your life in ways that seemed excessive or harmful? How did you recognize when concern crossed the line into manipulation or abuse? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from hearing about the possibility of survival and recovery. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that no matter how dark things seem, there are always people ready to help you find your way back to the light.